Well, thank you so much for joining us. It has been a while and we are in video format today. We're trying something new. And my next guest is a proud guinea pig for this venture. So I want to introduce you to Miss Erin Craw. She is a PhD student candidate. I knew I was going to get it wrong.
PhD student, second year.
Second year PhD student at Chapman University. And she is doing this incredible study on how communication and messaging is affecting mental health for our first responders, which is right up my alley. So thank you so much, Erin. I really love the name. I'm a little bit partial to it myself. And thank you for coming on.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for having me. I'm thrilled to be here and to be chatting with you. And this is such an important topic that deserves the time. So I'm really grateful for you to have me here.
And I'm excited. And I met you before. I actually went through your study and felt very, very comfortable and enjoyed talking to you so much. I wanted everybody to see how great you were and what you're doing. So that's why you're here. So tell us a little bit about yourself.
Sure. Yeah. So I'll start with, I am actually a CT native. So born and raised in Connecticut, Southern Connecticut, so pretty close to New York City. And I received my bachelor's degree at the University of Connecticut, and that was in journalism and communication. And so that's kind of where my love for stories started. I was a journalism student, and the reason I was, even going into that program was thinking, gosh, I want to learn about people's experiences and hear their stories for a living. And as I got closer to the communication major and started to do more research, that's kind of where my career took me. And so I kind of switched over to focus more on communication. And I went on to get my master's degree at Fairfield University, and that was a focus on health communication. And that's when I did my thesis. And my thesis was on mental health related conversations that occurred within police departments. And that was out of the state of Connecticut. And so I went around and talked to so many wonderful individuals who had so much to share. And a lot of them were police chiefs, some of them were psychologists or therapists who work with first responders, and then lower ranking police officers throughout the state. And what I found was that there really needed to be more research to be done, because there were so many different gaps that were kind of coming out and emerging from this research. I knew I needed to do more, but I just wasn't quite sure yet. And so now fast forward 2 years, and I'm out here in Southern California pursuing my doctorate degree. And as you learn more and more about the field of communication, you kind of get more comfortable with, where's my emphasis going to be, and where's my true heart in terms of research. And I'm going to tell a personal story now just to kind of shake things up a little bit. But this just kind of speaks to who I am as a person, but also as a researcher. So my father was a police officer for about 36 and a half, almost 37 years before he passed away about 6 years ago. And growing up, it was normal. I grew up in a police family, and that was just a normal thing. And I knew about his job, of course. He was my real life superhero, but he didn't talk about it too much. The only kind of times where there was a specific conversation about work, it was one of those, okay, girls, go upstairs and play while dad and I talk. So we didn't really know too much about his career other than the fact that he was Superman. And so that was kind of our perception of him, my sister and I, throughout his life. And, he kept it very private, which is pretty incredible to be able to do. And probably, looking back now, such a strain. But he worked the night shift a lot, probably from when I was in elementary school to almost high school. So there's a lot of years where, he's going out in the middle of the night and working in a dangerous city and coming home. And we would wave to our dad at the bus stop. He was pulling in and we were going out to school. And all of that was normal. I mean, when you grow up as a daughter of a first responder, that's just normal life. You know that your parent probably won't be at Christmas and probably won't be at your birthday, and those kinds of things are normal. But there was this one specific instance that has kind of led me to all of this research and my hopefully the rest of my career. There was this one day I was a teenager, maybe 16. I had that teenager attitude, of course. And, my dad had come home from a pretty terrible shift. I didn't know, obviously, but he had come home from a shift. To this day, I don't really know what specifically happened or what the call involved or what was going on that day. But I said something snarky, like your typical 16-year-old daughter would say. And he just reacted in such a angry and almost violent way which was so not like him, almost like throwing things and yelling. And it was just like a different human. It wasn't my dad. And immediately after, you could just feel the guilt and the shame and all of these horrible emotions. And he felt so bad for days, and really carried that, and, so apologetic. And I thought, gosh, I'm not mad. I forgive him, but where did that come from? And now, as someone who researches this and talks to individuals all the time about these kinds of things, I understand it. But that was really challenging for our relationship, but more so for him. And basically, what it really was is that this cumulative stress and trauma that he had been through. And there was this another call that day that involved a teenage kid. And again, I don't know the details of what happened that specific day, but I know it involved someone who was similar to myself, so maybe like a 16-year-old girl. And the point of me telling you this is because I think, all of the research that I'm trying to do and the reasoning behind it is to hear these stories. This is just one person. This is one police officer. And across the United States, how many of the first responders experience things like this, where you have to go from such a hard, challenging job where the stress is just piling on, the trauma is cumulative, and then you have to shift gears to be a parent or a spouse or a friend, and there's nowhere to put any of that. And so that's kind of where I put on my researcher hat from there on out. And that experience really does guide me, because hearing those stories really does make a difference. So when you talk to someone who's also had a similar experience, where now, instead of having that comfortable space where you can talk about things or go home and relax, now he added shame and guilt to his plate. And so, the kind of trajectory of my research career has really come out of trying to hear as many stories as possible, really immersing myself into what it means to be a first responder and the challenges that they go through, and to hopefully come out with some evidence-based practice so that we can improve the resources and the support that's for first responders. So I know that was kind of a long-winded answer to your first question was about myself, but again, born and raised in Connecticut, and being part of a police family has really impacted who I am as a person, but also as a researcher and the type of work that I want to do. And, my dad had struggled with depression, anxiety, and PTS for years. And we didn't really know as a family. And I don't think that he received the treatment that he could have gotten to live a happier and more fulfilling life in all different facets. So I think right now the focus is so important on wellness and overall mental health, instead of treating a mental illness. Like, let's focus on mental health and wellness. So that's just a little bit of background about me and how I got to this point where I am researching this topic.
Well, we have definitely established that you are very credible and have a great reason to do what you do, and you know what you're talking about. So and it's so funny too, to me, is that for every one of your dad, there are thousands more. For my personal experience, my dad was a firefighter my entire life, and he had a similar situation where I was probably 7 or 8, and he worked a call where a little girl who looked just like me got hit by a car on her bike. And I remember, him acting very strange towards me, and my parents being very protective of me and my sister after that, not realizing and not knowing that this is what it is. And I was telling my mom about some of the things that we're working on for first responder mental health, and like telling her about, talking to you for this podcast. And she said, it's a shame we didn't have this kind of support back in the 70s, 80s, and 90s, when these people who are first responders, who not give up their lives, but sacrifice a lot of their own well-being, because the spouses also sacrifice their own well-being because there's nobody else to talk to. You either go down to the bar and have a drink or get drunk with your buddies and you guys talk about the bad call, or you come home to your spouse who gets like secondary traumatized by it. So she was really grateful that finally there's support so that they don't have to suffer alone.
Sure. And it's such a good point about the spouse and the family. And a lot of the work that I'm trying to do toward my dissertation is looking at the ecological systems framework. And this is basically saying that there are all these different layers of our environment that impacts our behavior. And so if we think about that for a first responder, they're going from this high stress situation, if you've read Dr. Gilmartin's book, which is highlighting that hypervigilance roller coaster. So they're such high hypervigilant level, and then coming down from that is almost nearly impossible to do that as soon as they need to get home. And so you're coming home and you're trying to shift back to real life, and you can't do it that quickly. And so, tension between spouses, or, negative interaction with kids, or having that kind of, I would have moments or days where I would say, oh, I can't go up to my dad and say hi yet. He's going to just sit in his chair. And that's something that Dr. Gilmartin brings up in his book. I think he calls it the magic chair. And that absolutely resonates with a lot of families where they're home, but they're not. Kind of home, but nothing's there, or it's not your true person coming home. I actually interviewed a spouse of a firefighter recently, and she had said, I never really know who's walking through the door after a shift. Is it going to be my husband? Is it going to be a worse version of him? Is it going to be an angry version of him? And so, those stories really sit with me. And I think that this is really something that needs to be looked at from a systems perspective. It's not just this one aspect of their life. This is something that affects every part of who they are as a person. And, that's, I think, where we kind of miss the boat a lot in previous research, is looking at the full person instead of just saying, oh, they went through this horrible trauma or this one critical incident, and here's what we're going to do to fix it. That one thing is going to impact all the different systems that they're involved in. And it's very likely that they don't fix that one problem before moving on to the next. Mm-hmm. So spouses and families play such an important role, and they're affected too by the interactions and by the trauma, like you said. I know that's a fear of a lot of first responders, is that, gosh, well, how much information do I share? How much is enough? My mom was a daughter of a first responder also herself, so she kind of was primed to be able to handle that information, but not everyone is. And there's no course on how to be a first responder spouse, and there's no course on how to be a child of a first responder. And I'm not suggesting that there necessarily should be, but I think it's important to think about, if these people are going home, they didn't get the support maybe they needed at work, and now they're going home, but your family doesn't really know how to fully support you. So where are they going to go?
Yeah, absolutely. And then, you have people who say, well, they know what they signed up for. Well, no, you don't. People will tell you it will, you'll have burnout and it'll affect your family and you'll be stressed out. But I don't think you truly, really understand it until you're in the middle of it, and then you don't know how to get out. So no, the spouses don't know what they signed up for. And the people who enter into these jobs of lifelong service, no, you don't know what you signed up for.
Yeah. And Erin, that's such a good point about not knowing, even yourself as the first responder. That's something that a lot of first responders I've talked to recently have mentioned is, there's so much training at the academy level, and maybe there's an hour or two about mental health. Typically it's about mental health of the civilians or the people in your community who you might treat or protect or engage with, but rarely is it about your own mental health. And not only that, they almost never, from the responses I've gotten, never really pinpoint, you're going to experience these types of reactions. They are normal responses to abnormal events that you guys are going to experience, and it's okay. And I think that conversation, while it sounds so quick and basic, goes a long way, especially when you're sitting there for hours and hours and taking these courses and learning all the ins and outs about equipment and how to protect yourself, how to remain safe in a fire, how to remain safe in a shooting, all of these things. And they're equipping you with everything physically and lacking with the equipping you to handle the mental aspect. And that's huge. I mean, you're missing half of the person. So I think, that speaks, it's in itself of what needs to be fixed.
Yes. Amen, sister. And I already told you, we were going to scroll all over the place. So I've already gotten you so far down the rabbit hole, but there anything else that you can think of that we haven't talked about to address why first responder mental health is so important and those consequences of it being overlooked?
Yeah, I think that's such a good and really kind of loaded question. I think the first the first aspect of that is, I've used this word a few minutes ago, but I'm going to use it again: cumulative stress and trauma. I think when we think about first responders, it's always in response to something pretty catastrophic, like there's one major event. And when we think about first responder suicide, a lot of the time, those who haven't had the privilege, like myself, to talk to first responders on a regular basis tend to think it's, oh, there was this one horrible incident and then that was it. It's a cumulative process that is going on for a long time. And I'm now certified as a first responder supporter, and I took a course through Academy Hour with Amy Morgan, and she's absolutely fantastic. She's brilliant. And she used this great story to kind of explain where first responders, if you picture yourself kind of carrying a stack of books, as you add on books and add on books, it's harder to walk around and carry that stack of books. And so when we think about first responders, every incident is another book that's getting added onto this massive pile of books that you're walking around. And it's so hard to walk around with this stack of books, but you know that it's your job. So you keep doing it until you can't anymore. And I think, what really is the important takeaway for myself within the research that I've done thus far is it's not one incident. It's not, just fix it right after it happens. It's what's coming down the line. And when we think about PTS, it's post-traumatic stress. It's not the next day. It's not 48 hours. Is that person being supported for the length that they need to be supported? And what are the possible repercussions of not being supported? And I think, those are pretty endless. And the other aspect of it is, there's so much communication that's going around now about performance and policing, and so much tension surrounding the profession. And I think for police officers and any first responder, really, it's definitely related to performance. How could you possibly be your best self and be expected to perform at 100% when you're not being supported after going through some traumatic situation? How can you possibly keep going when you just went through something so traumatic and it's still your shift? So now it's the next call. And we don't think about that as civilians. And like I said, I am so privileged to hear stories like this, but not everyone is. And I think that's a huge problem, is education and awareness. But to kind of stick on your question for now, is I will just kind of go out on my own tangent. But to stick to what you were asking, I think definitely the repercussions, again, if we think about that model, it's going to impact everything, your relationships at home. My dad and I didn't talk for a week from that, and I internalized that and felt, gosh, what could I possibly have done? Why is he mad at me? Things like that. And that's minimal. But if we think about it on a larger scale, things like divorce rates and alcoholism, or the use of abusive drugs and things like that, well, that's all really related to not receiving the support and the care that they need after each incident or after a shift or whatever the experience was. But even, I'm going to challenge everyone that's listening to think about your hardest day, and think about if you had to keep going and go to the next hard day, the next hard day, and the next hardest day, and the next hardest day, without stopping and thinking and recovering. And that's what it's like to be a first responder. And I think, when we think about it that way, the cumulative nature of it, we need to start thinking about, it's not going to be that, every time there's a traumatic call, you're going to be able to take off the rest of your shift. I know that that's not realistic and that's not possible, but what can we do to support first responders to at least make them feel and have them know that the support is there and it's something that they would utilize? And so I think without that, the repercussions are physical, mental, relational. I think, just you name it, it's catastrophic.
So going into that, let's learn a little bit more about the study that you're doing.
Sure. Yeah. So a dissertation is a really big undertaking. So there's a few different phases and parts to it. The first thing I really want to know, and this is something that I think is going to guide every other aspect of the research I do for years, is to really take the time to understand what first responders need for support. What kinds of support do they prefer to have? So if you've gone through a trauma or even just a really challenging day at work, or maybe you're experiencing relational issues, it doesn't have to just be work related. I mean, these are human beings, right? It's not just trauma at work. It's all of the stress and trauma that surrounds you during your life. And so I think just understanding what they prefer and what they need is the first really basic component of the research. So I'm going to take a qualitative approach to this again, because I think the stories are the key aspect of starting all of this research. You can't really know how to create an evidence-based recommendation or implement an intervention without really understanding where the issues lie from the people that are going to utilize those interventions or programs. So if we come in and say, hey, we're going to create this mental wellness program, but we haven't talked to first responders themselves who are going to use it or who need support, it's likely that that intervention or that program or whatever is meant to help them will not work. And so I think that the very first aspect of this whole project is to really understand their preferences. Another thing that's important to look at that will be part of this project is, what is the messaging that's already out there? What are first responders already receiving in terms of verbal, nonverbal messaging about mental health? And I've really started to dive into this actually already, this aspect of it, the messaging part. And what I've heard is that there's such an inconsistency with messaging where they'll say, hey, we have these resources if you need them. And then that's it, never hear about it again. Or, hey, we have these resources if you need them. From leadership, they might say that. And then your peers say, oh my gosh, don't use that. We don't trust that. Or, don't do that. We don't need that, that kind of thing. And so I think when we think about messaging, that inconsistency part is so detrimental, because people are not, imagine coming into a space where maybe you do want support and this resource is there, but you've only heard about it once, or maybe other people don't really support it. And so you don't really know where to go or what to utilize. Mm-hmm. So that's the second part, is to really figure out what the messaging is. So preferences, how do they want to be supported? What are the resources that they need? And then what are the messaging that's currently going on? And then to start to look at where are the gaps, right? So here are the resources that are at this department. We have an EAP and we have a peer support group. Does that align with what first responders are saying that they need and they want for support? I've heard mixed results just about peer support groups. Some people love peer support. Some people say it's hard to trust peer support groups because it's still connected to the department. And so you still kind of have that strain of, is this going to get back to my boss, or do these people actually trust me if I disclose a mental health related issue? So maybe it's not just having peer support. Maybe it's having peer support in another type of program. We can't just do this one size fits all. And I'm going to use a quote from several participants actually have utilized this phrasing. And as someone in qualitative research, every phrase and word that the participant is using is so valuable, because that person is really telling you their story. And so the words that you choose to relay that experience to someone else is, it's a privilege to be listening to their stories. And so I try to listen to all the phrases and the words and really try to understand the best that I possibly can and interpret that. And there were several individuals who used the word check the box when I asked them about resources. And so, that check the box mentality, you can imagine how frustrating that is for first responders to feel like they're just doing it to look good on paper. It's just about checking the box and getting it over with. So the other aspects of my research are to look at those gaps, to look at, here's what they're saying they need. These are the messages they're receiving. These are what's available at the department, and where can we kind of address those gaps? And a lot of it is going to be really rooted in communication.
Yeah. And the checking the boxing is huge. It's avoiding liability or doing what is socially acceptable or what their moral or ethical obligations are supposed to be, but not actually follow through with it, or, putting any type of real, let's do this. No, well,
sure.
This is what's here if you want it, but we're not actually going to advocate for you to actually use it. And so I've heard the same thing about EAP, as far as people don't want to use EAP. They don't trust it because they don't want their higher ups knowing their business. They're afraid that it's going to get reported back. And then the same thing with peer support. Peer support's great. And like we personally use it, and I'm part of a peer support nonprofit. But at the same time, it may not be the thing that you need. But if we
Sure.
can offer different modalities, then we're catering to people as a whole, and we're taking care of people as a whole, like you said.
Yeah, and I think, the evidence-based recommendations would be the final kind of outcome and deliverable from the dissertation. And the reason for that is because a lot of the times in research, we're really looking for how to improve a situation, but do so based on the data. And the data are the people's stories. So for me, it's talking to people and really engaging and learning their story and having that experience of them letting me into that piece of their experience and having them kind of recall what they've gone through, and then to put all those kind of pieces of these stories together and really illuminate the issues from the participants' point of view, from these first responders' point of view, because we can't help without knowing what they are specifically going through. So to come in and say, hey, we're going to start this program, I've heard it works for this other professional population, that's going to be no good, right? So we have to really go to the source, and so that evidence-based practice and evidence-based recommendations is really the heart of all of this. And that's saying I want to take the time, and I don't know that this has been done enough in research, especially surrounding first responder mental health. Take the time to hear the stories, understand what they're saying they need, and then look for the discrepancy. We brought up the EAP. So many people that I've spoken with already have really expressed a true frustration with the EAP. And a lot of that comes from, and again, this is not to say that every EAP is the same way, but I'm just going off of the information I've received so far. A lot of the frustration comes from the fact that the trained therapist or psychologist or whoever they go to is fairly new to the profession, but not only that, are not specifically trained, for the most part, specifically trained on how to work with first responders. So now you have a first responder who we know that is a very difficult thing to admit that you have an issue or that you're going through something and that you need support. And so now you get to the point where you are asking for support, and you're talking to someone who maybe doesn't understand the profession, who might not have a good idea of what it means at the basic level, things like shift work, or understanding why you would be in a certain scenario, or understanding the cumulative nature of stress, and that it's not just this one thing that's going on. Maybe that's the thing that got you to come to seek help, but that's not the one thing that's affecting, your whole career. And so I think for a lot of the people that I've spoken with, a lot of the first responders, it's, if we're going to go seek help, we want people to understand at a level that you possibly can understand. So be trained in things like first responder culture, and understand basic terminology, understand as much as you possibly can without being a first responder yourself, or at the same time being a first responder yourself. People that I've spoken with, that's such a plus when they know that someone has that experience or that connection. Maybe they're a spouse or a child of a first responder, and so they have that perspective, because without it, it's not a cookie cutter response to these experiences that first responders are having. And so I think that that's really an important thing to be thinking about and to be moving toward.
Culturally competent clinicians for first responders are so important. And I hear this so much is because, one, you don't want to have to re-explain what your job is, or if you slip into 10 codes, they're going to stop you and say, okay, what's a 1010? Or, so having that cultural competency is so beneficial. And then the other thing too is what I've heard, I don't know if this has been mentioned from any of your respondents yet, is that sometimes our stories are so traumatic, a person who's not a first responder can't handle them. So sometimes we're the ones that are traumatizing the people that we're supposed to be helping us. So, that clinician being prepared to know that the things that we're going to say are going to be really hard and are able to take us through that is so important.
Definitely. Yeah. And that has come up, Erin. And I think, even in the course that I took, I was certified as a first responder supporter, and Amy Morgan does such a good job of compiling interviews and videos and really trying as much as possible to hear those stories ahead of time so that, she'll check in with you and in the course and say, it's not for everyone to be a supporter of a first responder. So if you're hearing these stories and you feel like you can't handle any more stories, then this is not for you. And so I think, having that self-awareness too, as someone who wants to support a first responder, to really understand, are you doing them justice if you're sitting there and you can't, of course you're not going to be numb to these stories, right? Of course you're not. And the first responders aren't either. But you can't make it about yourself when you're trying to support a first responder, because they're so vulnerable in that moment to come for support and to look for someone to help. And so I think that's probably very frustrating to go seek support and to have to worry about, oh gosh, now I've upset them, or now I'm consoling them, or, now I have to find a different person because they clearly can't handle it. And I think it's kind of the same fear that first responders have when talking to their spouse, right? Is how much can they handle? Are they going to get upset? Am I going to make things worse? So you're carrying around this like dialectical tension between, I want to share and get help, but I also don't want to make things worse for the people that I'm seeking help with. And so you definitely don't want that from a mental health provider. That should be someone that you can go to, and that they understand your job. That they're not going to, ask you basic questions. I had talked to this first responder, was a firefighter for years, and said he spent 6 sessions just kind of building the rapport and having the person understand what it meant to be a firefighter. And so, you could just feel the frustration in his voice when we were talking. And it's, they don't have the time, first of all, right? First responders are always busy, juggling a million things. But then on top of it, after a critical incident, you're usually questioned for, a length of time, and you have to kind of replay that. And so the last thing you want to do when you go seek support for that is to answer a million questions. And so you just kind of want to go and have that rapport not take so long to build, and not have that trust take so long to build. And first responders tend to be a little bit harder to gain their trust for a series of reasons. And so you want to make sure that as a mental health provider, and there are some fantastic ones out there that have really specialized in first responder wellness. But the focus of their work is to make sure that they're creating a space where the first responder can openly share at the level that they prefer and they want, and to have someone get it as closely as they possibly can if they're not a first responder themselves. And part of my research is to talk to those individuals and really try to understand how they've been successful, how they get people to get to their door, and how do they get into that world. And part of that is to just build that trust and that rapport, but you have to have a clear understanding of that culture first.
Yeah, there's so many facets, and it's just amazing that you're taking all of these different threads of mental health and communication and regarding being a first responder and trying to weave it into something cohesive that makes sense to people. So I definitely commend you for it. Is there anything else that we may have not touched on as far as like what your outcome you hope to see, or what your, I don't know, like your hypothesis? I don't know research, so I don't know if you can talk about that.
Yeah, so that's a great question. I have a series of research questions, and it'll be a mixed methods approach because, like I said, I really think that this type of research warrants hearing stories, as many stories as they possibly can, and to speak with as many people as it possibly can, because the story is of such high value, and that's going to help inform, what can I ask that's on maybe more of a quantitative level? How is that information going to then inform maybe like a quantitative survey where I can reach more people quicker, but have that be informed by these first responders? So what kinds of questions should I be asking? What kinds of things should I be looking into? How do I know where the gaps are if I'm not talking to first responders themselves and really spending the time to get to know them and to get to know their experiences? So it'll be mixed methods. I have a series of research questions that I'm working on now, but I think something that maybe I haven't talked about quite as much as I would like to bring up is consistency. I think something that I really want to come out of this research is to start making things more consistent across departments. And that, I mean that by consistency in terms of internal messaging about mental health and wellness, right? If we introduce it at the academy and never talk about it again, then that's not very consistent. So, it starts there. It starts with leadership. It also starts with looking at different departments. So if you look at like LA, wonderful department with so many resources. But if you look at a smaller department, such different opportunities and resources. Well, it doesn't necessarily mean that those police officers, EMS, dispatchers, whoever's working in that different town doesn't need that same support, but it's not consistent. And so I think consistency is going to be key. And like I said, in so many different aspects of that term, consistency within the department and across departments, and consistency in messaging. I think, if I work in California and then I go and work in Connecticut, the messaging about mental wellness in first responders shouldn't be different. And I should have the same resources. I should be able to be as supported as possible in Connecticut and as supported as possible in Massachusetts and Virginia and any state. And I think that's huge. And so, that's, I'm sure, years and years down the road. And I hope to have a very vibrant career. Again, such a privilege to work in this kind of work. But to be able to improve the consistency of messaging and the consistency of how communication is really surrounding mental health and wellness within departments as well, because it starts internal. If the messaging within the department is negative or non-existent about mental health and wellness, it's not really going to matter if we have all of these outside programs. We need it to come and start really internal and start from the top.
Mm-hmm. And then I think a big key in that too is fitness for duty.
Absolutely.
Utilizing these resources and asking for help. It shouldn't be a black mark on your review, or you should lose your job because you went into depression. I think that's a huge barrier for any type of mental health program or resource, because people are scared they're going to lose their job because, you get psychological testing for a lot of these jobs. And, I guess you're not crazy when you go in, but we make you crazy. So that's definitely something that I'm glad that you're checking into and researching.
Yeah. And I think, desk duty is a bad word. And that's, to be put on desk duty and have maybe your weapon taken away, or be put on leave because you have depression, or maybe you're going through PTS or whatever it might be. I mean, think about any other job. You don't care if your accountant has depression, or you don't care if the clerk at the grocery store is suffering with anxiety. We were put in on this pedestal that first responders can't have these issues. And if they do, then they're no good for their job. And so I think, part of that consistency is going to be, whether it's yearly trainings or yearly check-ins or whatever it might be, but to shift from moving toward punishment to prevention, right? Stop punishing the first responders for having an issue and then coming and talking about it. Work toward prevention and making it normal. And I think the results will be so positive on so many different levels if the shift can be made from the messaging that's around mental health. I've heard things like the kiss of death if you say you have any kind of mental health related issue. I mean, that terminology, that says everything right there to you about how first responders view this. And so if we can fix the messaging aspect of it, and this is a huge undertaking. I don't expect it to be just from my research. I think this is a all hands on deck effort, but those are the kinds of things that we need to focus on in terms of messages and communication surrounding mental health for first responders, is looking at not just here's a pamphlet on the EAP, or here's a brochure on the different aspects we have, and you can go through all these different resources. It's the micro interactions too, right? What's being said between peers. There's probably a lot of things that are being said non-verbally and verbally between peers about mental health. And Erin, I'm sure you know this yourself as a dispatcher, but I think we can't look at it from, let's just fix this problem with this one thing. It's so many different things, but so much of it is surrounding communication and the messages that are going on around mental health. And so I think, looking at starting with first responders themselves and hearing those stories, and to try to get more of that information about like the kiss of death, that phrase, to know what that really means in the first responder world is so key. How can we address that? How can we make it so it's not the kiss of death? Well, then we need to make sure that people who voice that they have a problem are not sent into exile, culturally. And, I have multiple people in my family who are first responders, and one of them was a police officer and was struggling with mental illness too. And was put on desk duty, and it was the worst thing for that person at that time, because the last thing they needed was to be isolated and to feel like they were failing at something else. And so we really need to rework that aspect of it.
Oh, I totally agree. Like, to have these programs in place where we're mitigating the situation without taking them away from their love, because most first responders are there because they love it. So you're
Sure,
taking
of
them
course.
away from what they love and what they know. And then you're also making them feel like they're utterly incompetent. So that's another stressor on top of whatever it is that they're dealing with.
Of course. And it's identity. I mean, just, you talk to any first responder, for the most part, I would say 9 out of 10, if you ask them to describe themselves, they'll start with the first responder, that's the kind of work they do. And, you know, depending on who they're talking to. But I think that that identity piece of it, it's, you know, I am this job. This job is very much a part of who I am. And so imagine, you know, people who aren't first, I always try to kind of look at it from both angles, right? The first responder, but then to try to help other people who, again, don't have the privilege to talk to first responders so closely. If I'm talking to, say, a friend or a peer at Chapman just about the research, it's, you know, I try to put it in perspective, try to think, if you couldn't do the one thing that gave you purpose in life because you were struggling with something that was caused by the thing that you do every day. And so it's all related, and you're putting your heart and soul into this job. I mean, you don't become a first responder for the glory or the money or the fame, none of that, right? Because all of that is not really there. So you're not becoming a first responder for all those things. And so it's really this like identity profession, but you're now telling people that the trauma and the stress that is caused by doing that profession is now going to hinder your ability to stay within that profession and keep doing your job. Instead of supporting you for doing that job, we're going to say, oh, if you can't do it because you have any kind of mental health issue, you're out of here. And so I think the punishment factor needs to move to prevention for sure. And all of that starts with talking about it.
Yeah, let me blame you for the problem that we created, and but we're going to hold you accountable for it anyway.
Yeah.
I've run us off that rabbit hole again. I told you I geek out about this, so
No problem. I do as well.
so let's talk about. I sign up for your study. What
Mhm.
can I expect? Can you walk us through the steps?
Absolutely. Yeah. So I think a big fear always with qualitative research is, you know, how is my identity going to be protected? How is this really anonymous? And you know, fearful of course, like anyone would be, that everything I say is going to be attached to my name. So if you agree to be interviewed or part of a focus group, if it's going to be something qualitative, it will be with me. And so we'll do an interview almost like this, very conversational. And really the goal is to hear your story. And so what I'll do is set up just a series of questions that really guide the conversation, but it's really, it's there again to be exactly what I said, a guide, and to really learn more about the individual and their experiences. And then I use pseudonyms. So I take out the person's name, give you a fake name, and then what I'll do is any identifying information, maybe if you say the name of your department, or you say the name of a peer, or whatever comes up that might be identifiable, that's removed for the purposes of the research. So anything in the analysis and anything that's ever written up for a manuscript, that's all, again, confidential and becomes pseudonyms, or just taken out completely. So it really is, you know, a conversation, learning more about the experience, and then using that story in the research, hopefully to illuminate issues, and also to highlight some things that maybe are going well, or emphasize areas that we need to work on. But for me, the most important aspect of this research is to make sure that their voice is heard. So I try as hard as I possibly can to give them that voice within the research. And so I spend time with them talking and recording, and then going back and looking through that transcript. But like I said, I do want to emphasize, I know this is a fear of a lot of people, is that it really does become confidential. I don't use any identifying information.
Yeah, and when I talked to you, it was like talking to a friend. I actually felt better after getting off of the Zoom with you, because I felt a little bit lighter. Like, I really appreciated the fact that someone who wasn't a first responder was taking interest, and that was genuinely wanting to hear what was going on. So I think if people do decide to sign up for it, just be pleasantly surprised. You know, it's like, I don't know, what is it, about an hour, maybe?
Yeah, about an hour is typical. Yeah.
I mean, I could probably talk for more, so I don't even know how long ours was, but
Myself as well.
yeah. So I mean, it was just nice, and I felt like I got to be a part of something that may help first responders down the line in the future. So it was pretty cool.
Good. I'm so glad that you had that experience. And I love the notion of helping other first responders. I think, a lot of the people I've talked to is they just want to share their story so that other first responders that read this or hear this or, see something else say, oh, okay, it's okay for me, or it's okay to have similar feelings or things like that. So that's definitely a huge plus of this type of research.
Mm-hmm. And have you gotten a pretty good response?
I have, yeah. I mean, it takes time. So I completely understand, sometimes it's kind of hard to plan and to, get on Zoom for an hour, but I've had a great response. I'm so lucky and so privileged to have a great network. And I'm always looking for more people. I can never have too many stories to share and too many stories to put into this research. So always looking for individuals who are willing to be a part of the research. But I've had a great, really, really wonderful experience talking to people thus far.
Oh, good. And I think we kind of already covered what kind of concerns people had going into it. Was there anything else that we missed?
No, typically it's just, where's this information going? What are you going to be asking me? Is someone going to find out it's me? And I know for myself, even, just anyone doesn't want their name necessarily attached to things that they're talking about that are really personal or that are related to work. And so I really value that and want the people to understand that I do everything in my power to take out any identifying information to make them feel as comfortable as possible.
Perfect. And do we get to read it when it's done?
Absolutely. Yeah. So if you're not connected with me on LinkedIn just yet, please do. Erin Craw, you can find me on LinkedIn, and I post about research all the time on there. And I absolutely will share things that hopefully become published and are able to be shareable.
And so, as we're kind of wrapping up, because I don't want to take up too much of your time, but from what you've gained already and what we haven't already talked about, is there anything that you can give our supporters, the people who are listening and now watching, information, tips or tricks, educational aspects that you can provide really quickly about benefits of messaging or what kind of messaging we should do in communication for mental health?
Yeah, so I would say, the first thing is I already used the word consistency, but to take the time to really understand how messages affect people. So those conversations that you might hear, for example, if a chief or someone who's in charge says to another police officer who works for them, say, "Oh, you're okay, right?" and pats them on the back. Well, what is that really communicating to that person? Like messages really matter, and to hear stories over and over again about situations like I just described, where it's you're okay, or there's an EAP, but you don't really need it, or we have these organizations that could help, but I'll give you the numbers if you ever need it. Things like that, right? Those messages are said so quickly and so usually without a lot of thought, but they go a really long way. And that's how this culture becomes, that really cultivates this type of culture where it's just kind of brush it off, move on, go to the next thing. And that really harms, mental health over time. So I think having that awareness of what messages can do and how they can impact people is huge. And then to be consistent and clear in messaging. So if my chief is really great, but then the people that work underneath him are not as supportive of mental health, so which one is it? Am I okay to say something, or am I not okay to say something? If I have a really great chief who's very pro mental health and wellness, but my lieutenant is very anti. So, that kind of tension, I think creating that tension for them, for any first responder, just creates so much more stress, because now you're navigating this whole new layer of understanding mental health. And so I think consistency and being clear in your messaging. And the other thing that I want to encourage anyone who's listening that's not a first responder is to really take what I was saying about this cumulative stress and trying to understand what these first responders go through every day. It's not just this one big incident in their career where someone probably has one or two traumatic experiences in their lifetime. There's probably hundreds. I know a firefighter had said, maybe 800 for a 30-year career. I mean, that's what these individuals are going through. And so if you can take anything out of what I'm saying, it's understanding that it's a cumulative problem, a cumulative stress, and it's not a one size fits all fix, because people are going through a series of different, very challenging experiences. And so that's why messaging is so important, because when that's all that's surrounding you about mental health, all you've heard are things like, well, I'm not crazy, or I'm not the person running in the street naked, so I don't need medication, right? And so, those messages they go such a long way, and we need to start thinking about how to use these stories, use these experiences, like that individual that said, this was after a shooting. This gentleman had told me this story that his chief just kind of patted him on the back and said, "You're good, right?" Those are the stories we need to share, because that messaging has to stop. That assuming they're fine, not allowing them to say anything else, that has to go. So I don't know if that was quick, but that's my response.
No, that was good. And I just think like that's subliminal messaging. You're fine, right? I'm telling you, you're fine, whether you are or
Right.
not. And you're going to agree
Absolutely.
with me, right?
Absolutely. Mm-hmm.
So if anybody wants to sign up and be part of your amazing study and, be a little bit of a piece of history for first responder mental health, how do we find the link to sign up? And then how do we find you for more information, or if anybody has any questions?
Sure. Yeah. So definitely my LinkedIn account is huge. I go on that every day, and that's where I'll post study information, the links, how to find me, how to sign up for the research. But you can also email me at Craw, CRAW, at chapman.edu. You can also reach me there. But LinkedIn, like I said, or email, either way, and I'll get you obviously connected to the right research and aspects of the study.
Okay. And then I'll also post all of your information on our resources page on the website and also on
Fantastic.
the podcast, wherever you get your podcasts. And now we have a YouTube channel, surprise. So I'll put it in the
Fantastic.
comments as well.
Wonderful, wonderful. And thank you so much for your time, Erin. It's such a pleasure to talk to you again. And like I said, that my heart and soul is in this for the rest of my career. So I'm excited to have the privilege again to keep moving forward and meeting people like yourself.
Yeah, we should do this a thing. And I definitely want you to come back after everything's done and we can talk
Absolutely.
about how it finished out and maybe, just chat some more.
Sounds great. I would love that. Absolutely.
Okay. Is there anything else we didn't talk about, we missed, anything that you really want to emphasize before we go?
No, I think just, I'm so grateful for anyone that has shared their story with me already, and for the experiences I've had. I've been able to join a coffee and conversation group. I'm doing some research right now with an organization called First and Wellness. And that program is really looking at resilience and building resilience in first responders from a coaching perspective, and to really look at the individual. So I've had just great experiences working with a range of different opportunities and organizations. And so I'm just so grateful for everybody that's kind of opened up their door to me. I know that it's hard to trust a newbie, a PhD student who's kind of coming out of the gate, but I can assure anyone that has worked with me or is planning to be a part of my research that this is my heart and soul. I'm very, very passionate about this type of work and think that this is something that deserves a lot of attention and heart. And so I'm thanking everyone and looking forward to meeting additional people.
Well, you have to come back and talk about coaching too, because we didn't even get to
Definitely.
that part. So that'll have to be another episode for sure.
That sounds great. I would love to do that. Absolutely.
Well, thank you, Erin, so much. I really appreciate it. Thank you, everybody else who's coming back after my long pandemic hiatus. I appreciate you still being around. And that is it for now.
Thanks so much.